and we are going to begin. Can you hear me okay, Don?
Yep, Don, you're good to go.
Okay, great. So this is the economics of carbon pricing, something that those of us at CCL are really are empowered by. So the author E.B. White once said, "Every morning I wake torn between a desire to save the world and an inclination to savor it. This makes my day hard to plan. But if we forget to savor the world, what possible reason do we have for saving it?" Well, savoring must come first. And today our speaker, Dr. Charles Sims, he savors the world when he is mountain biking and when he's hiking. When he's not savoring, he's busy saving, and he does that as being the director of Energy and Environmental Program at the Howard H. Baker Jr. Center for Public Policy, and also an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So I asked him what led to his focus on carbon pricing, and he said it's because it's so front and center for economics. His professor in Wyoming wrote one of the first papers on carbon taxes versus cap and trade. So I guess he was hooked from there. Dr. Sims believes carbon pricing and supports it because of its solid economic grounding. His work has been published in refereed journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. His work has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy and the USDA. So I really want to thank you, Dr. Sims, for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Don. That was a great introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen here. All right, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Wonderful. So yeah, I'm going to spend a bit of time today talking about carbon pricing, and I promise I'm not going to put any of those supply and demand figures on the board and talk about those and shifting supply and demand equations. There'll be no equations, no math, but we're going to talk a little bit about just kind of the general idea behind carbon pricing, which I think will be familiar to most people in the audience here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the different aspects of this that we need to move forward. Let's see. So there's plenty of things in the news about this kind of convergence between climate change. A lot of it comes down to how much of an economic impact is climate change going to cause. And then there's this debate about whether combating climate change is kind of counter to any sort of economic growth, whether there is some hard trade-off here that we have to face, or whether these two things can actually be complementary and that we can fight climate change and have economic growth at the same time. And then kind of the third kind of prong of discussions around economics and climate change has been, how do we go about doing this? And this has been a debate between kind of cap and trade policies versus kind of renewable energy standards versus carbon tax. So I want to talk, I'm going to frame most of my discussion today around the economist perspective on climate policy. And I think the first point that I want to make is that 95% of economists support some action on climate. And the reason is that the prices just don't reflect the damages that are caused by burning fossil fuels. And that's the fundamental argument that economists use for introducing these policies. So if you go to the grocery store and you're looking at items in the store that have prices on them, those prices are sending you a signal about how much it costs to produce those goods. And in general, economists are perfectly fine staying out of the way and avoiding policies if we think those prices are actually sending the correct signals to consumers. Where we think policy is needed is when we think those prices are not sending the correct signals. And in this case, we have plenty of evidence to show that goods and services that are produced by burning fossil fuels do not account for the damages that come from burning those fossil fuels. You'll hear economists refer to this as a market failure. And what that basically means is that the markets as they are now are acting as if fossil fuels cause no damage whatsoever. And then that, like I said, that inability of the prices to reflect these damages really economists use as their benchmark for identifying the need for a carbon policy. So I want to highlight that because there's economists who are just kind of philosophically supportive of climate policy. But there's also a lot of conservative economists that are not interested in the environment at all that still say, yes, this policy makes sense from an economic standpoint. And I think that's a big distinction that I wanted to kind of draw out here at the beginning. This isn't just a number of environmental economists who happen to love the environment and are advocating for a policy. Now I wanted to frame my discussion today on the economist statement on carbon dividends, and this is just because this does a really good job of kind of explaining where economists come from. But I'm sure most people have seen this, but if you haven't, it's effectively 5 policy recommendations that have been supported by a number of different economists, from secretaries of the Treasury, former chairs of the Federal Reserve. We've got 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors and 27 Nobel laureates. And the key thing here is that these are all Republican, these are economists that have served under Republican and Democratic administrations. These are economists that are liberal leaning, conservative leaning, from all walks of life here, that are supporting these basic recommendations. And the first one is that a carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. And the idea here is that by correcting this well-known market failure, that the carbon tax will send a powerful price signal that harnesses the invisible hand of the marketplace to steer economic actors towards low carbon futures. And we're going to dig in a little bit to what I mean here, but this idea of carbon pricing, we're talking specifically in that recommendation about a carbon tax, and a carbon tax is just one example of carbon pricing. And that's kind of a catch-all term for any sort of market-based strategy where you're attempting to put a price on carbon instead of, say, just mandating new renewable investments or new renewable fuel standards. And the idea behind that is that once you get carbon accurately priced, that the market forces will start to push people away from these more carbon intensive behaviors, and they'll seek out new technologies and engage in new behaviors that are less carbon intensive, because it's basically just more costly now to burn fossil fuels and produce that carbon. Now, like I said, the alternative for that is that you just mandate that businesses and companies invest in new renewable energy technology. And economists generally think that the carbon pricing is a cheaper way of achieving a carbon goal. And I'll talk a little bit more about why they believe that in a moment. But I'm going to talk about it right here. So economists prefer carbon pricing to these renewable energy standards. So an example might be a renewable portfolio standard that a number of states have. And they like it because it's more cost effective. And more cost effective just means that if you told us what was the carbon goal that we had, we will reduce emissions by X amount by 2040 or 2050, that carbon pricing is going to get us there for a lower ticket, or a lower price tag. And that polluters are all different. So there's been a number of studies that have gone through and looked at across different sectors of the economy and across different industries and across different plants, how much does it cost to reduce carbon by 1 unit or one metric ton? And it varies a lot, which sends a signal to economists that there's going to be cheap things that certain companies can do, maybe just investing in more fuel efficiency, maybe just changing the time at which they run certain machines. But for other businesses where things are very dirty, you've got old technology, maybe there it makes sense to adopt a new technologies along the way. But it's that difference in the pollution, the polluters, that signals that there is no silver bullet, and the carbon pricing allows businesses the flexibility to find what is the least cost way of achieving whatever pollution control goals we give them. It also provides an incentive for polluters to innovate. So we hear a lot about wanting to fund new renewable technology investments at the federal level. And the reason we're obviously doing that is because we think that there isn't that incentive to do it in the private sector, well, a carbon price would effectively create that incentive for private businesses to go out and innovate so that the federal government doesn't have to do all of that innovation along the way. Like I said, there's two primary types of carbon pricing. There's the carbon tax and there's cap and trade. Economists have been debating the relative merits of these two things for 50 years. And really, it's kind of it's a neck and neck race. But economists of late have really come down on the side of a carbon tax. But the basic difference is that the carbon tax, the government would be setting the price of what carbon would be, and then the market then determines what the quantity of carbon emissions would end up being. Cap and trade kind of works the exact opposite. If cap and trade, the government determines the amount of emissions, and then the market determines what the price of carbon will be within that marketplace. Like I said, there's been pros and cons that we've talked about for a long time in the economics world. Carbon tax is basically the reason we like it is it's very transparent. It's very clear what's going on. The cons for carbon tax is that it usually requires a lot of information. And this is sort of what economists would think of as the first best. We need to know a lot about kind of the different technologies that are being used in these polluting industries, but most of the carbon tax proposals that we have now are based on a different method than what economists have typically thought of, and so the information requirement is not as heavy as it has typically been. Cap and trade, the pro on a cap and trade is that you don't have as much information requirement. You don't need to know as much about the firms you're regulating, and that was always kind of a check mark for cap and trade. The cons are that you're essentially creating another market. You're creating a pollution market, and a pollution market can suffer from the same market failures that the market suffered for in the first place. And so if you create a new market, but you create a market with a market failure, you're going to end up creating more problems down the road anyway. So economists of late have started to err on the side of a carbon tax, and definitely have erred on the side of a carbon tax when we've paired it with kind of ideas of revenue neutrality, which I'll talk about momentarily. Just to give you an idea, the map here shows all the colored in countries here are countries that have some sort of carbon pricing policy in place, either a carbon tax or a cap and trade policy. The table gives you an idea of kind of the two big metrics that you want to use to judge these different programs. One is what share of emissions are covered. Obviously, you want the more emissions that are covered, the better. But what you see is that oftentimes in many places, certain industries will receive exemptions, and they're not covered under any sort of cap and trade system or any sort of tax. And so obviously for a very strong program, you want that percent covered to be upwards of 100%. And then the other thing that you start to see is what are the prices that are actually emerging here. And they're relatively low relative to some of the other programs we've seen. But a lot of that has to do with those numbers on the right-hand side there. If you have a program where you're only covering 20% of the emissions, that's not a very robust cap and trade system. And so your price is naturally going to be lower. The other thing you see is that when we do have carbon taxes, they're basically just set to raise revenue. They're rarely set to actually achieve any sort of emissions goal. The recommendation too is that this carbon tax should increase every year. And that would increase until emissions reduction goals are met, and it should be revenue neutral to avoid debates about the size of the government. This constantly rising carbon price will encourage technological innovation and large-scale infrastructure development. It will also accelerate the diffusion of carbon-efficient goods and services. A couple of things to point out here is this idea that any of these programs that are proposing a carbon tax are generally talking about an initially low tax that rises over time. So the blue line is the Citizens Climate Lobby proposal that I know many people are familiar with. And that shows that we're starting at a relatively low rate compared to some other programs, but increasing faster, so that by 2040, 2050, the carbon tax would be much higher than it would be under some other proposals. We've got the CLC proposal, which is another proposal backed by former Secretary of State Baker. We've got 3 or 4 other proposals here that are different carbon tax policies that were evaluated by at Stanford University under their Energy Modeling Forum, each of which is starting at a different initial carbon tax. So we've got these 2 that are starting off at $25 and then are rising it's slightly different over time. The idea here, again, is to talk about this idea that the big two things that are under debate is kind of where do you start your carbon policy, and then how fast it should rise over time. And this is still a point that economists will debate about where that initial point should be and how fast it should rise. But I think one of the things I wanted to make clear is that any policy is better than no policy at all. And so I don't want to give the impression that debates about slight changes between $25 or $30 or $35 is signaling that economists are unsure about whether there should be a policy at all. We're all on board with the policy, and any of these policies would be better than having any policy at all. And one more thing I wanted to point out was that in every one of these scenarios, they've shown that there's very little deviation from GDP. So you hear a lot of times, various people will say that if any of these carbon taxes are going to kill the economy. We've not seen in any of these scenarios under any model where we deviate any more than 0.1 percentage points from the reference growth scenarios, meaning that even if you do see a decrease, many times you see an increase in the economy, if you do see a decrease, it's going to be relatively small. This deviation that's due to the carbon tax is actually much smaller than many of the projections of what the economic impacts of climate change will be. Revenue neutrality, I think everybody probably knows what this is here, but this is this idea that the carbon tax revenues shouldn't sit with the federal government and they should be given back to citizens in a couple of different ways, either to offset other taxes or just rebated directly. The big reasons we want to do this, obviously, are we want to avoid any debates about the size of government. It's hard to get consensus on any climate policy if you have fundamental debates about the size of government that are getting in the way. And so rebating that revenue is obviously going to take away that argument because the government's not growing under this policy. The other thing that it does is it helps households offset any of the increase in prices. So carbon pricing is going to increase the prices of goods across the economy. That's effectively how it works. But by rebating this revenue back to citizens, most of the policy analyses that I've read show that over half of the U.S. citizens are actually going to come out better because they're going to get rebated. The amount that they're going to receive in a rebate is going to exceed the amount that they would pay in increased prices for goods and services across the economy. Recommendation 3, a sufficiently robust and gradually rising carbon tax will replace the need for less efficient carbon regulations. It's also going to increase regulatory certainty that companies will need long-term investments in clean energy alternatives. So the idea here is that once you price carbon, you may not need a number of the other regulations that you've had in place. I would prefer to keep that as a separate argument at the moment. I'd prefer to just think, let's get the carbon tax in place, and then we can evaluate if we need to repeal or move away from some of the other regulations that are in place. But the idea is that once you have the carbon tax, you wouldn't need those regulations, or they'll become effectively non-binding. They won't be influencing anyone. The other big thing is the regulatory uncertainty. So a recent study by the Baker Center showed that between 2005 and 2012, the uncertainty concerning climate policy was increasing stock price volatility by about 9% and decreasing investment by about 1/3. And so that's just the uncertainty. That's just this kind of pendulum swing that comes when administrations come and go and Congress switches power, where you hear debates about maybe a carbon tax is coming, maybe some other climate policy is coming, and that uncertainty is creating a drag on the economy in and of itself. So the idea here is that just inaction itself is costly, and some carbon tax is going to relieve some of this uncertainty. Recommendation 4 is speaking to, so the idea that if the U.S. were to impose a carbon tax, that they may be at a trade disadvantage, and that we may see firms leaving the U.S. and moving to other countries. This is something that happens all the time. This is not an issue that we can't deal with. We've got tariffs that can be imposed to address this issue, and because this comes up in a number of different settings, not just environmental policies. And we have the tools in place to deal with this issue. This should not be something that is dragging down debates about climate policy. But the clear point here is that if we do this right, it would create incentives for other nations to adopt similar carbon price policies. And so I think the key is that the U.S. should see this as an opportunity to get more folks on board, more countries on board with carbon policies, because if we would impose tariffs on countries that are still abstaining from some sort of climate policy, that's going to put them at a comparative disadvantage in trade, and then that will create an incentive for them to jump on board as well. The fifth recommendation that I wanted to touch on is to maximize the fairness and political viability of a rising carbon tax. All revenues should be returned directly to U.S. citizens through equal lump sum rebates. The majority of American families, including the most vulnerable, will benefit financially by receiving more in carbon dividends than they pay in increased energy prices. So I'm going to talk a bit about this. So I think really, for years people have said, well, carbon taxes have been talked about since the 70s. Why have they not gathered any sort of momentum and seen any sort of support? Well, it's because we've only really talked about this revenue neutrality issue rather recently. I think economists, probably to our discredit, we underestimated the importance that came from this debate about the size of government, and obviously creating a tax and having the government keep the tax revenues is obviously growing government. So if you're fundamentally opposed to that, you're going to be fundamentally opposed to a carbon tax. Just recently, economists have started that is an issue, and so we have started to talk about these revenue neutrality issues and how we can address that. There's been a number of ways we could use it to offset other distortionary taxes like income taxes. And economists have typically liked this because when we say distortionary taxes, these are taxes on things that we actually like, right? We like people to make income. We like people to work. We have taxes on those things, not because we want to discourage them, but because we need them to raise revenue. And so if we can tax something we don't like and then take a tax off of something we do like, we would be much better off in the long run.
Excuse me, Charles, we have about 9 minutes left. We're going to want to get some questions in, so if you could wrap in the next couple here.
Almost done. So the other idea is that you could use it to invest in renewable energy. This is obviously one of the proposals that was talked about in the state of Massachusetts, was the state of Washington, was to take the tax revenue and invest it in renewable energy. There's been a number of studies that have gone through and shown that that actually makes the tax more regressive. And a classic example here is that the tax credits from clean energy investments have gone disproportionately to higher income households. If you were to use the revenue to create tax credits to try to encourage people to invest in more fuel efficient heat pumps or put solar panels on their roofs, it's usually higher income people that are taking advantage of this. And so that makes that makes it even harder on lower income folks. The rebate to the citizens is more transparent, and like we said, it ensures that low income households are going to be left financially unharmed. And so this is sort of that third option, is the one that people have rallied around of late. It's also, just to kind of wrap up, it's also where you see most support. So what you have here are two bar graphs showing support and opposition. This is from a survey on energy and environment out of the University of Michigan. A base case carbon tax that shows support for a carbon tax without talking about what you're going to do with the revenue. And then next to it, you have what is the support for that same policy if you're going to make it revenue neutral and use it to lower income taxes. And we look at how people support this across Democrats, Independent, and Republicans, and you can see that support obviously goes up across all groups, and especially among Independents and Republicans when you say you're going to take that tax revenue and rebate it in some way. So in summary, economic argument is for carbon policy is strong. Carbon pricing can achieve these climate goals at lower costs than renewable energy standards. And then there's broad support for a carbon tax that has those two characteristics. The rate is increasing over time, and the revenues are going to get returned to U.S. citizens. And that I can take any questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. So we have a lot of questions here, more than we have time for. Let's get to as many as we can. A couple folks asked something to the effect of, some people are skeptical of carbon pricing in markets. After all, carbon prices in and of themselves don't actually reduce carbon emissions. How do we know that people and businesses will actually reduce carbon emissions when faced with a carbon fee?
Well, I mean, as long as we believe that people are going to respond to difference in price, then I think they're going to reduce their emissions. So if it becomes more costly to do something, in general, we believe that people are going to do less of it. And so you're right, it doesn't directly reduce the emissions, but in almost any other instance you can think of, if I raise the cost of something, people are going to do less of it. And we've seen this, and emissions have gone down in many other places where carbon taxes have been implemented. Now, the question may be that we don't know exactly by how much those emissions are going to go down. And that gets back to that question of, well, under a carbon tax, you're basically fixing the price, but you're letting the market determine how much the emissions are going to drop. So I think most people would say, oh, I believe they're going to drop, but under a carbon tax, maybe I have more uncertainty about how far they're going to drop. But again, I think that's going to get caught up in this idea that we can, as we're adjusting this tax rate over time, there will be the ability to increase it and decrease it as we see fit as we move along to kind of achieve those goals. This is going to be a long-term thing. Under none of these issues or under none of these proposals are we setting a carbon tax and then leaving it and hoping for the best.
Okay. Peter wanted to know, what do economists in general think about how to handle the case where we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere? Should the carbon tax in that case be a payment for private actors who can remove carbon from the air?
Sorry, could you say that one more time? You cut out on me.
Sure, I'm sorry. What do economists in general think about how to handle the case where we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere? Should the carbon tax in that case be a payment for private sector actors who can remove carbon from the air? In other words, should they receive a tax credit if they can pull carbon out of the air?
Yeah, so that is a good question. And I think that would depend on how you were to characterize that tax. In the most simple version, yes, you would give them a tax credit along the way for reducing that. If you have a carbon tax set appropriately, then those firms that are receiving the tax could then pay these other private sector companies to remove the carbon tax or to remove carbon from the atmosphere for them. So there is a question about who would be supporting that kind of secondary industry. Economists have gone back and forth on that one as well. But I think most of where the economists have come down on is to just make things as simple as possible, that if you're a company that has come up with the ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere, you would receive a tax credit just because it is the most transparent, kind of counterfactual to the carbon tax.
Okay. Will a rising carbon tax this is from Chris, will a rising carbon tax cause fossil fuel companies to extract and sell more fuel now before it becomes too expensive to sell?
Probably not. So I think I've got a few people that I know are working on this question. The idea I think now is that the more short-term thing has been the impact in natural gas, at least for oil and coal. And so there's already a number of reserves that are what you might call stranded, that are going to be stranded whether you impose the carbon tax or not. There would potentially be some assets that would be stranded through a carbon tax in the natural gas sector. Those would probably not be capable of getting those out of the ground sooner. But at the end of the day, I think the question is going to become, does a firm, knowing that these carbon taxes are going to rise over time, does a firm want to take the risk on identifying new reserves over time? And I think the answer is no. And I don't think that they're going to be going out to find new reserves. Would they want to extract from the reserves that they've already identified? There's a lot of evidence that shows that it's simply too costly to store those reserves. So it's actually very costly to get oil out of the ground and store it in barrels and store natural gas in tanks. And so they're going to be limited in the degree to which they can do that. If they try to flood the market early on in anticipation of a carbon tax, they're going to be met with very low prices for these goods. And the argument was they'll just hoard them, right? They'll just hold on to them until the prices go back up. But again, it's very costly to store that much oil, that much natural gas, waiting for prices to go back up.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one more. So isn't the EU planning to impose a border adjustment? This is from Dan. How will that impact the US and other countries' policies?
Yeah, so I think that's going to be maybe end up being one of the big impetus for us to potentially think about this in the future. It will be a trade argument that we will be at a trade disadvantage with some of our big trading partners if we don't also have a policy. So it's kind of the flip side of what I was mentioning before, is that the US could do this to kind of spur carbon action in other countries. I think increasingly we may be seeing argument from other countries that we trade with saying you're going to receive, or your goods that are coming into the country are going to get hit with a tariff, and so you're going to be at a comparative disadvantage. At this point, you've basically heard two arguments from this. You've heard people who have said that climate policy is basically just being hijacked into a way to receive a trade advantage. And then you've heard other people who have said kind of what I was just arguing, was that along the way, we're seeing more of a push for carbon policy because it's going to help, it's going to actually help us in trade.
Okay, I think we might have lost your video here, but thank you, Charles, so much, and thank you for all who have attended this session. And so we'll be taking a short break now before we go into our next sessions. So thank you all. And Charles is once again, take a look at his email if you have questions that did not get answered. Charles, will you be willing to answer a few if they come to you via email?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. cbsims@utk.edu, and thank you all.